All right. So, as I mentioned earlier, my specialty is flavor. So, you're gonna hear throughout the 3 days quite a bit of emphasis on, quality in general, and flavor maybe in particular. And we have a lot of speakers that will reinforce that. But so I wanted this talk to be the very first one you hear because, of course I think it's so important because I work on it. But we can, as consumers, we can all agree that, flavor is pretty darn important, right? When we open a package and we expect, to be pleased with our taste buds when we eat something. So, I heard a lot of people are in quality assurance, right? So, let's just pause for a moment and ask ourselves, what do we mean by quality? What is it, And it will, I think that if I did a survey of this room, I would get, 40 different answers. Probably some similarities here and there, but, based on your role in your work, what you do, what you produce, where you are in the post-harvest chain, your focus is going to be different, right? Some people, might want, longer shelf life because, that helps with logistics, and other people are going to be focused on safety, and then you go all the way to the consumer. And again, there have been a lot of different studies, consumer surveys, and time again we come back to this notion of flavor, right? And price is important, safety is super important. Those are kind of like the baseline. So in a way, flavor is sort of like the cherry on the cake. But as we're going into the 21st century, people are getting a little bit more, shall we say, demanding, right, on the quality of the product they eat, right? They expect safety, they expect a good price point, but they will pay a premium if the product is good. And by good, I mean delicious, right? So that's kind of what is written out there, is that, generally overall consumer acceptance has been linked to flavor acceptance very strongly. Okay, so the purpose of this talk is just to introduce some vocabulary and some notion. What do we mean when we talk about flavor? Those sorts of things. So if we think about, assessing quality and assessing flavor as a human being, as a consumer, we really use the entire array of our sensory systems, right? So physical and chemical. Our physical senses, we're pretty, well acquainted with them. It's hearing, it's vision, right? Like Dennis likes to say, consumer buys with their eyes, they come back with their taste buds, right? So taste buds would be in the chemical arena, right? Our chemical senses, taste and odor, smell, right? And so those two things really also play a role. All right, and so as a sensory person will say, flavor is really a complex combination of all of these things you see on the board. Probably more, you can add sound to this, but so there's definitely appearance, right? We buy with our eyes, taste, smell, that's the chemical senses, irritation and pain, that's, if you bite into a chili pepper, right, you'll get the pain sensation from the capsaicin, that's an irritation response. And then texture, super important for some commodities. Temperature can play a role. As I said, sound, right? If you bite into an apple, it does make a sound, right? And the sound of that bite actually relates to the texture. But, anybody ever worked in the chips business? So chips, yes? Did you ever, were you ever involved in, those crack tests that they do, and they look at the sound that it makes, right? And that relates to freshness, right? So all of these things actually kind of play into flavor, right? And of course, we don't do this consciously, right? It's all integrated in our brain. We do this, all the time when we're exposed to a food that we eat. Okay, so I'll just break down the two chemical senses because those are the ones that, sometimes we're not quite, well acquainted with, even though we use it every day. So taste, in the strict sense, it really only means 5 different things, right? And so you taste things with your tongue. You have taste receptors, taste buds on your tongue and nowhere else, right? So technically, if someone asks you, what does it taste like? You have 5 possible answers or a combination of those 5 possible answers, right? So the 5 taste modalities are sweet, salty, bitter, sour, and umami. Okay, so we have innate, as babies, we are drawn to things that taste sweet, salty, and umami, right? Sweet because it brings us energy, salty because it helps us regulate our osmotic balance, right? Our cells need some ions to regulate themselves, and then umami, that's the protein, right? So we need protein in our diet. And then we reject innately bitter and sour tastes. And that's, again, as we're born, we don't learn those things. We are born that way. And then, of course, later on in life, we acquire new tastes, right? So most of us now, don't reject sour foods, right? Some of us can even seek them out, or bitter for that matter. IPA lovers? Anyone? Yeah? You'll get some tonight. All right, so let's do a little quiz here and say what in your kitchen, your pantry tastes sweet, like a very basic ingredient. Yeah, it's Tuesday morning, it'll get more complicated. Okay, sugar. Yeah, thank you. How about salty? All right, yeah, okay. Very, very hard. How about bitter? Okay, so hop, I give that one away. What else? IPA, that comes from the bitter acids and the hops. What else? Poppy. Coffee, sorry. Coffee. Yeah, I was like, ooh. Okay, coffee, absolutely. Yeah, coffee, the caffeine, right? So a lot of these things that taste bitter might be alkaloids that you find, or, in cucumbers, sometimes you get that bitterness, and that's coming from certain terpenoids that are produced, maybe as a result of chilling during growth in the ends. Okay, so then sour, vinegar, lemon. It's really interesting because sometimes people mistake sour for bitter, so it's important to kind of see the distinction here. How about umami? MSG. Yes, MSG, absolutely. What else? That's soy sauce. Yeah, absolutely. Soy sauce, Parmesan, of course, meat, right? So that's the protein taste. In fruits and veggies, umami character isn't all that prominent, except for a few things like mushrooms, right? Very umami, depending on the variety. Also tomato, right? Because tomato has one of the highest glutamate content in a fruit or a vegetable, right? And someone said MSG, what's MSG? Monosodium glutamate, right? And so here we kind of break that apart. There's monosodium. What's sodium? It's a salt, right? So what happens when you put salt on a tomato? You make MSG. That's why it's so delicious, right? Because the glutamate combines with the salt, and it just brings out that nice taste of the tomato, right? Of course, not all tomatoes, right? We all know the sad, story of the flavor that left the tomato a long time ago. Yes, all right. Okay, so this is basically a table that summarizes some examples of components, molecules that you can find in fruits and veggies that are responsible for giving you those 5 taste modalities. Okay, so now let's switch to aroma. So we talked about taste, and remember, everything for taste happens in your mouth. Now, aroma is everything that happens in your nose, right? So you probably hear that I have kind of a lingering cold, right? And so my nose is not quite working like I still have, not quite there with the aroma, right? So when you get a cold, have you noticed how things start tasting different? Well, they don't actually taste different. They smell different, right? So your tongue is totally fine. It's doing its job. It's perceiving the sweetness and the acidity and everything. It's your nose that's all plugged up, and it prevents that perception of aroma, right? And so what is aroma? Aroma happens when you have small, tiny compounds, molecules called volatile compounds, that are sniffed up in your nose, and you have an olfactory bulb right up there, very close to your brain, where you have your odor receptors, okay? And these small molecules will bind to your odor receptors and send a signal to your brain. That's what happens when you smell a rose, or you smell a cantaloupe trying to desperately find a good one, or if you eat something, right? So if you smell, it's pretty straightforward. The volatiles go up, right? The aroma goes up in your nose, straight into your nasal cavity, and up to your olfactory bulb. When you eat, things go the back way, right? So that's called the retronasal perception of aroma. So have you ever seen people, like maybe professional wine tasters, and they kind of do this gargling thing, right? Right? That's actually to enhance the retronasal perception of aroma, right? They're not doing that just to show off. They're actually, enhancing that perception of aroma by, refluxing air up into their nose, right? So that's retronasal perception. And so when you have a cold, basically that back way, everything's blocked up here. So you prevent those nice aromas from going into your nose, and things have a different flavor because you lose aroma, right? And that's what happens. So I'm on the recovery side right now. All right, so I've talked about volatile, molecule, volatile. What is that, right? Because, we're comfortable with sugars and maybe acids, right? But what's a volatile? So very simply put, a volatile is a tiny molecule that has a high tendency to evaporate. You're exposed to those things all day long. Maybe this morning you put on perfume, or, if you are into aromatherapy, all of these essential oils that we can buy in the store, they're basically concentrated volatile blends, okay? And so a volatile is if it's in liquid form, it's going to be very oily, right? It doesn't mix with water very much, and it has a high tendency to evaporate, and that's how it gets into our nose. So every living thing on this earth produces volatile compounds naturally. We can also make them artificially, right? There's a whole business around, flavors and fragrances. And aromas are typically complex mixtures, right? So, for example, a strawberry aroma can have up to 200 different volatiles. So these are some examples, right? You can see kind of how small the molecules are. So very complex things, and it's no wonder that, perhaps they've been kind of left out of, breeding programs because they're kind of hard to measure. Even though we can smell them very well, the instruments are not, are kind of complicated to measure them. So just to continue with the volatile idea, these are 3 examples of volatiles. This is beta-ionone right here. It's in tomato. But if you smelled it by itself, and you were in the fragrance industry, you would describe it as floral, woody, sweet, fruity. So it doesn't have a very clear, oh, yeah, this is, tomato. Certainly not, right? But it's part of the blend that the tomato produces. Broccoli makes a lot of sulfur-containing volatiles, and that, is probably why our kids don't like broccoli very much, because it's very recognizable, this sulfur-containing type of volatile. And then myrcene is in mango. If you've ever eaten a little bit of mango peel, there's a lot of myrcene in there, so it's kind of like this peppery, spicy sort of volatile compound. Okay, so each and every one of these compounds has a smell. Of course, in a blend, you don't get the sum of all of the parts here. You kind of get a new sensation. Kind of like when you listen to a symphony, right? You don't listen to only the strings or only the piano, right? It all comes together and blends together to give you an idea. So the people who work in that field, they're actually able to pick out, the individual compounds, just like, a refined ear would be able to pick out the alto violin, from the cellos and all of that, right? But, most of us, it's kind of hard, and we just perceive it as a blend. Okay, so to make matters a little bit more complicated, our nose has different sensitivities for different compounds. So for example, here, beta-ionone, our nose is quite exquisitely sensitive to it. Not so much to myrcene, right? So you can see how it starts to be even more complex. I told you that in strawberries there are 200 different volatile compounds. 2 of them are furanol down here and acetic acid, right? So acetic acid is volatile, right? And anybody ever smell vinegar, right? You do. I mean, it's a smell, right? It's the smell of vinegar. That's acetic acid. So guess what? Strawberry makes quite a bit of acetic acid, right? Do you smell ever vinegar in a strawberry? Not really. It also makes this compound called furanol. And in fact, if you look at the abundance of these 2 compounds, acetic acid is much more abundant in the strawberry compared to furanol. It's kind of like a tiny, tiny, tiny amount. But because our nose is so sensitive to furanol, we can pick it out in parts per billion, right? Compared to acetic acid, it takes like a whole bottle for us to be able to start smelling it, right? So then you can see how, even though there is more acetic acid in the strawberry than furanol, it's really furanol that's key and not acetic acid, right? Okay, so I'll say a few words about aroma biology, just to kind of expose you to, what's possible and what we're all doing in this arena. So these are the kinds of questions that we might want to answer when you're doing aroma biology. So how are they made in plants? How is their production controlled? And what do we do, right? Pre-harvest, post-harvest, what do we do that influences the production of these things? I get more and more calls from people, especially in controlled environments, telling me, hey, if I tweak this, or if I, expose them to higher light, or I stress them a little bit, yeah, the flavor will start being different, right? So, and there's not, I'll be honest with you, there's a lot of sort of empirical knowledge out there. Not a lot of real scientific-based evidence for that. And part of the problem is that every commodity is different, and sometimes even, it's different from cultivar to cultivar, right? So you have to tease that apart. But, basically the idea here of this research is, to start understanding how we can maximize quality, flavor quality, to its full potential and maintain it after harvest. Okay. So I won't bore you too much with biochemistry. I just want to remind you that, biology and physiology are very important. You'll have another talk later on by Angelos about fresh cut biology that goes, more in detail about, okay, what happens when you cut something, right? Because the things you're handling are fresh. What does it mean? They're alive, right? So they respond, they react, just like us, right? What would happen if we cut one of our fingers, right? Right? So in a way, it's important to really understand what's going on, what you're doing, how the product might react, right, to that. And so it starts way in the field, right? So we have this beautiful process called photosynthesis, right, that happens in the green parts of a plant. And then through that process, the plant makes sugars. These sugars will then be allocated, right? It's a resource, and this resource is allocated, in the case of a fruit, to the growth of a fruit, right? The fruit cannot photosynthesize, so it needs food from the green parts. And then these sugars are broken down and made into all the building blocks that the fruit needs for its growth. Okay, so it's just like a baby, right? It needs food in order to grow and to make more stuff, right? So how are volatiles made in plants? So, this area of research has been around for not that long, maybe now 2 decades. We've started to make headway into understanding that. And so what does that mean when we say we want to understand how they're made? Well, we're looking for genes, right? The genes that control the production of these molecules. Okay, so I'll give you just one example. And it's one that's kind of nice to know because it's so ubiquitous in fruits, right? Just about every fruit out there has some form of a gene called AAT. And that stands for alcohol acetyltransferase. So it's a mouthful, but basically what this gene does is it takes an alcohol that the plant produces and takes this other molecule and it merges them together to produce an ester. And esters, volatile esters, you have examples here, are really, really important for the flavor of a lot of fruits. Apples, bananas, pears, mangoes, strawberry, a lot of different fruits have AATs and have this possibility of making these volatile esters, right? And so, I work a lot on melon. Melon has 4 different genes like that, and it produces a very wide range of volatile esters. Okay, so the other point that I would like for you to take home is that the answer to how the production of these compounds is controlled in plants, well, as far as climacteric fruits are concerned, ethylene is the trigger. Okay, so everybody here understands when I say climacteric fruit and ethylene? Maybe not everyone. Okay, so I'll take a step back. I know Angelos will touch on that. So repetition is key, right, for learning. We all know this, right? So ethylene is a gas, right? And maybe some of you have worked with it, right? We expose fruits to ethylene to make them ripen. Not all fruits though, right? Do you expose strawberry to ethylene to make it ripen? Nope, because strawberry is not climacteric, right? Strawberry doesn't have its ripening process enhanced by ethylene, right? So there's two groups of fruits, and Angelus will touch on that in the next talk. So in climacteric fruits, and the fruits where ethylene really is a trigger for ripening, right? So if you think of ripening, right, what happens? Color changes, you have sugar, conversion of starch to sugars and softening and aroma production. And so if you take away ethylene, you take away aroma, right? And this is what happens exactly with these fruits. They were actually made quite a long time ago now in France, of all places, even though, France is one of the staunchest critic of GMO technology. But so this fruit on the right has been modified genetically to not be able to produce ethylene. Okay, so the one on the left, and by the way, this is a Charente melon. This is a melon that we're not used to seeing very much here in the stores. It's a French variety. It had, I say had because breeding has come to the rescue a little bit, but it had terrible shelf life, right? Back in the 90s, and it's a big thing in France, right? When it's Charente season, people go crazy, you get them on the road stand, but you have to be quick because you get there, you get your melon, you go home and you eat it. You cannot leave it on the counter for more than a day because it gets mush very quickly, right? So can you believe that? Like post-harvest nightmare, right? But it's so good. It's so good. So I have a confession to make. I'm French, right? So I love this stuff. But for the American palate, they seem to be like too musky or something. There's like too much aroma, something like that. Well, so anyway, it was a proof of concept. The group of scientists that did this, they were really back then studying the effects of ethylene, right, on the ripening process of the melon. And again, as a proof of concept, they said, what happens when we remove ethylene from that fruit? So we modify it so that it cannot produce ethylene. That's what this guy is. And so, right, a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? So what happens? Wow, enhanced shelf life. They look beautiful, don't they? But the problem was no more aroma. Oh, that was sad, right? Because the one thing that was so important for the quality of the Charente was the aroma, right? So you remove ethylene, you remove aroma, right? In climacteric fruits. Okay. So what do we do pre-harvest? Again, we know that just about anything we do that affects the physiology of the plant in the field or in a controlled environment facility is going to affect your finished product, right? You stress it, you remove, so some people in tomato now, it's dry farming, it's a big thing around here. I live in the Bay Area, and it's a thing, right? And it does seem to, enhance flavor in some respects. Again, not a lot of strong science behind it. Post-harvest factors, and here I'm going specifically for fresh cut and cut fruit. So, there's a lot of science happening. If you have access to scientific articles, this is sort of like a gross summary of the findings. So you have treatments of fruit, either pre-cut or post-cut, but pre-cut treatments with heat ethanol, ethylene, can alter aroma properties, right? So all of these things, I just told you that ethylene is really important for aroma development, right? So it can enhance aroma production if you treat your fruits. And you'll hear more of that later on during the day. Pre-processing treatments with ethylene inhibitors, like Smart Fresh, also affect the aroma quality and decrease the overall aroma. And as a rule of thumb, aroma, as soon as you cut and you package, aroma fluctuates. And it doesn't fluctuate in a linear pattern, unfortunately. It fluctuates, maybe it will rise a little bit in the first couple days and then it will decline. In veggies, it's much of the same thing. Here we have a different blend of volatiles, and so they may respond differently. They will respond differently to ethylene, for example. But generally, it's more of a wound response that you see for veggies and leafy greens, and the production of these degradation products of fatty acids, which is basically saying you're cutting, so you're going through the membranes, which are made up of fatty acids, and those degradation products can be released as volatile. So in fresh cut and post-harvest, you're basically, I like this image because you're treading a very, very subtle line between trying to suppress the metabolism of your fruit or your veggie, and at the same time, by applying methods, like modified atmosphere or controlled atmosphere, you have the risk of tipping the balance into fermentative metabolism, which may create off-odors. And so I get asked a lot about off-odors because it's an issue not only in fresh cut but in other commodities as well. And unfortunately, it's we all want a simple answer, right? And it's never simple. It's actually quite complicated. It's very hard to pinpoint to particular molecules that can cause off-odors. Sometimes, again, it is the product of fermentative metabolism, and so things like acetaldehyde ethanol cause off-odors. But really often it's a shift in abundance, right? I told you the story of furanol and acetic acid, right? And they all have different ratios. And sometimes it's just the commodity metabolism changing, and all of these ratios of naturally occurring volatiles shift, and that's where you get off-odors. So sensory to the rescue. I promise I'm almost done. Basically, if you really have off-odor issues, you want to do measurements with machines, and you always want to use people and combine those two approaches to give you the answer you need, right? Sensory science is very complicated, so the bottom line here is pair up with someone who has the knowledge before you try in-house, ad hoc sensory panel tasting things, right? Because generally it's not going to give you the answer you want. Okay. So I said that already, but it's really crucial to understand the physiology, and we'll hear more on that with Angelos and with Marita. This idea of flavor and harvesting at maximum potential, retaining that flavor potential. You'll hear more of that from Beth Mitchum and Dennis and Tim in the back. And, sensory is a tool that you can use for that. And I said that I can talk for hours on that stuff, so I think I did pretty well.
Thank you, Florence.